Final Fantasy VI has a lot of characters. In fact, there are way too many characters. A big and reasonable complaint to have with the game is that it spreads itself too thin when it comes to the main cast. However, I think that all of the major characters in the story each have their own little chance to shine. So, let's look at all these characters' greatest moments and talk about why they're some of my favorites. Of course, where to begin but with Terra. She is the main character of the game for a large portion of the game's run, after all. Terra is a pretty revolutionary character in terms of writing, and she has a lot of great moments due to having a lot of focus given to her. Her coming to grips with her aromanticism and her learning about her heritage as a half-esper are both worthy contenders. However, I think her greatest moment is when she rejoins the party in the world of Ruin. After vehemently refusing to rejoin the party when Celeste and Sabin first visited her in the name of taking care of her children, she ends up coming around again when she draws on her power to protect her adopted children and realizes that she needs to save the world to create a future for them. I like that the game doesn't deny her aromanticism, but also gives her something to care about that's completely separate from being romantic. It's such a powerful and surprisingly progressive moment for a Japanese game from 1994. Next in line should also be no surprise, Locke. Locke is a bit of a creep, and the more I think about him, the less I like him. He keeps his dead girlfriend's body in his basement. Like, that's fucking gross. What does her family have to say about that? We have no idea. The game never tells us. The game doesn't even really frame this as a bad thing. It frames it as tragic and romantic for Locke. Not, like, fucking disgusting that he keeps a dead body in his basement and preserves it. Whatever. I think his best moment is when he finally stops obsessing over this dead body and moves on because her ghost says that she's not coming back. It's a real moment of maturity for Locke for him to give up his weird obsession with a dead lady. Granted, me saying that's a moment of maturity shows how low my standards are for the guy. Come on, man, do better. Edgar has always been a personal favorite character of mine. My favorite moment featuring Edgar has to be when he and Sabin have their conversation while escaping Kefka's tower at the end of the game. It's such a powerful conversation for the two brothers to just have a moment to speak to each other, finally setting aside their differences and clearing the air between them. We hear what each one thinks of the other with no strings attached. I think it's really underrated, and it's definitely my favorite of the character vignettes we see during that escaping the tower sequence. Some might say I should have talked about the coin flip instead of this, but that's what I'm going to talk about for Sabin. It almost feels like cheating to include them as separate characters, as despite each of them having several scenes to themselves, their best moments are the ones they share. My favorite Sabin moment, I already said, is the coin toss. While not the first moment in the game that convinced me it was different, it was yet another moment that showed me how dedicated to player choice this game's and its cutscenes intended to be, and it fundamentally changed my idea of how video game party structure could operate. Before this, I thought that parties were fairly arbitrary in terms of storytelling. I had played a lot of the Mario games, and usually it was just a little bit of different dialogue between scenes depending on who you used in your party. But here, it changes the story completely. We get to see the pathos and backstory surrounding these two characters in an optional cutscene. If you don't sleep in the beds at Figaro Castle with Edgar and Sabin in your party, you never see this scene. It's powerful, it's beautiful, it's so emblematic of everything I love about Final Fantasy VI, your personal party determining the story. As much as I talk about this mechanic, I wish it was an aspect that had more focus in the game. As the game goes on, it starts to matter less and less. But anyway, the song that plays, Coin Song, is a great and melancholy usage of the Edgar and Sabin theme. And later, when you find out that Edgar rigged the coin toss so Sabin could win, just makes the whole thing so much more touching. A deal between brothers where one sacrifices everything for the other's happiness. Just one incredible isolated moment from this game. The character that made me want to get into this game was Shadow, mostly because he's a ninja, and I was 12 when I first played this game, and 12-year-olds think ninja are cool. That's because ninja are cool, but that's a subject for another day. Shadow is much more than just another cool ninja. He's a man with a haunting and sordid past involving regrets and betrayals, and my favorite moment with him is the dream where he abandons Barum in the Veldt after robbing a train. Though there are several great dreams that you encounter by sleeping in an inn with him and your party, this one has to be my favorite due to how it changes everything you know about Shadow in just one scene. The entire game, Shadow was established to be a cutthroat mercenary. Edgar even says when you first meet him, he'd kill his best friend for the right price. He abandoned his entire family. And yet here he is, his best friend begging to kill him, but Shadow refuses to. He can't bring himself to kill his best friend. It's a perfectly stark contrast to show us another side to Shadow that we might not have even considered in the first place. Now, you might think of this as a bit of a birdwalk, but I think that Bannon actually does have a moment that's worth mentioning. You know, Bannon, the leader of the Returners, who doesn't actually do much of anything in the story? Yeah, that guy. Well, my favorite moment surrounding him is when he tells the story of Pandora's box. Though he doesn't mention it directly by name, it's pretty obvious what it's supposed to be. It clearly has an impact on everyone around him, and because it's a story that actually exists in the real world, it feels familiar. It's like an old storyteller sitting down and telling you myths and legends of places that no longer exist. It's a powerful moment that leaves the party questioning their motivations at the time, and I don't think it gets enough credit. The story just relaxes for a bit after it, and the entire party has something to say about it if you seek it out from them, which is really, really cool in a game as fast-paced as this. The main character for the second half of the game is Celeste, who is honestly one of my favorite video game characters of all time. She's an ex-Imperial general who ends up joining the party, and there's a lot of mistrust among the party members because of that. Not as much as I would like there to be, but still a lot. She also has a romantic subplot, but manages to not be defined by it, which is quite impressive for a game from 1994. Her greatest moment is also probably my favorite moment from the game, barring the ending sequence which I gushed over in another video. Celeste's attempted suicide. After the world ends, she wakes up with only her sick grandfather, and when he dies, she has no idea if there's anything left for her. So she jumps off a cliff in order to end her own life. But she lives. She persists. She finds a bird with Locke's bandana on it and takes it to keep moving forward, finding a raft and riding it out onto the waves in order to find her friends and stand against Kefka. It's one of the most beautiful moments in any game, and it's the true rock bottom of the game emotionally, and we see her rise up from it. When playing as Sabin, we are first formally introduced to the character known as General Leo. Now, this character isn't even a main character in the story, but a significant amount of time is spent on him, so I think he's worth a mention here. My favorite moment surrounding him is when he stands against Kefka and Thamasa after the Empire betrays the truce with the party. He just watched Kefka murder a ton of Espers and turn them into Magicite instantly with an insane amount of power, and yet he still stands his ground against him and does his best to defeat him. He gets killed fighting Kefka valiantly. Even though he was an enemy of the party, General Leo was honorable to the end. Someone else who has a high code of honor who we are introduced to when taking control of Sabin is Cyan Garamonde, my personal favorite character from the game, an old samurai with a fear of machines and a love of his family, the family that gets taken from him in some of the first scenes featuring him. Cyan is such a hard character to choose a favorite scene from because he's my favorite character in this game and one of my favorite characters in any game ever. There are so many great moments with him, but ultimately I have to go with his soul dungeon. I'm a sucker for dungeons where you go inside someone's brain. My favorite game of all time is Omori, and a lot of that game takes place inside the main character's mind. Cyan's mind has so much depth and earnest reflections of Cyan as a person in it that I could make a whole video about it. And I'm definitely going to talk about it a lot if I do a full video on Final Fantasy VI like I plan to. There are so many interesting details, like sexually provocative enemies that are indicative of Cyan's fear of sexuality, or the fact that him being stuck on a ferry to the afterlife completely traumatized him and makes him a good portion of his subconscious. Onto a lighter subject, Gao is a weird character. Not a lot of people seem to like him, but I think he's fun for the most part and isn't really supposed to be much more than that. His most endearing moment has to be when he finally meets his father, and he even dresses up in a suit for him as opposed to his usual monster skins. Even though his father rejects him, Gao is satisfied with the encounter, and it's overall very cute. Sakaguchi himself has said that Gao was only really added to flesh out the world, so it kinda makes sense that my favorite moment of his isn't really that meaningful. It's just cute and a little somber, and sometimes it's all you need. Next on the list is Setzer, who is a character that has a really cool aesthetic and some, interesting character choices, that's for sure. Setzer is a guy who's obsessed with his dead girlfriend, much like Locke, but instead he gets his sick kicks by kidnapping an opera singer who kinda looks like her, maybe. Yeah, I don't think he's all that great. Needless to say, I think Setzer's greatest moment is when he finds his dead girlfriend's airship underground and he pulls it up and out of the sea, breaking through the waves. It's a beautiful moment. Walking through the crypt and seeing Setzer's memories of his lost lover plastered on the walls is honestly astonishingly beautiful and technically impressive for the Super Nintendo. It's a sequence that I always look forward to when playing through the game, and I wish that Setzer had more focus put on him over the course of the game to maybe make him a bit less creepy. Let's talk about Sid, a character who's in most Final Fantasy games that dresses like a banana this time around. For a character who has so much lore and tertiary materials, such as his extensive knowledge of botany that is detailed in the book Final Fantasy VI The Complete, he doesn't really have a lot of prominence in this game. However, I do think there are some moments with him worth remembering. I think that, in particular, learning that he had taken care of Celeste for a year on an island where they were the only two survivors was a great part of the story. He worked himself to death just to make sure she had a chance at life, and ultimately that ended up saving the world. It's a plot beat not a lot of people think about, but it's really powerful, and I think it could have used some more time to sit. Celeste reflecting on this could have been a really great scene. I guess I'll talk about Maduin, Terra's father, but honestly he's a character I don't really like. He makes a lot of stupid decisions on impulse. I don't really like his story. It's the Esper saying this is going to cause a bad thing to happen, and then it does happen because he did it anyway. There's nothing really interesting for me there. I do really like when he tells Terra that she might disappear, which raises the stakes even after the final boss fight. It's a crushing moment because one of the characters we've gotten attached to can completely disappear from existence. But honestly, Stego could have told her that. He even brings it up before the final dungeon if you have him in the party. Maduin's interlude was a part of the game that I never really liked that much. Which brings me into why I don't like Emperor Gestal. This interlude with Maduin features our first real look at the Emperor and all his ruthlessness. He's just boring. He's a boring character. His motivations are to simply rule over everything indiscriminately, and he doesn't really have a backstory or complicated feelings about the shitty things he does. His most interesting moment is his cunning deception of the returners at the dinner banquet, but he's just a very stock villain, and I'm glad he doesn't stay in the story for a very long time. In a brief side quest after the Vector, we are introduced to Mog, the slam-dancing Moogle. I don't really have much to say about Mog other than my favorite scene with him being where you learn that the Moogles have gone completely extinct, besides him. Those creatures that helped you out in the first dungeon of the game are now completely wiped from the face of the planet. The big problem I have with this is that the game doesn't dwell on this at all. Mog barely mentions it. I just really like the implication of that scene. And if there ever is a Final Fantasy VI remake, I'd like to see that story thread explored in any capacity. Maybe Mog and Cyan could bond over losing the land and people they'd come to know over their entire lives. This game has so much unrealized potential, I swear, and I really would like to see it become, well, more realized. Stego is a character that I've never really thought that much about. He's an old goofy wizard, and he's pretty hard to think of as remarkable. He and his granddaughter, Realm, are characters that I take issue with due to them basically only existing to make Shadow more interesting and compelling. With that being said, I really like when Stego snaps out of being a member of the cult of Kefka after hearing Realm's voice. It's such a heartwarming moment to see an old grandpa being saved by his granddaughter. There is a cut but scripted scene from the game where Stego would have asked Shadow to take off his mask, and depending on how this would be implemented in the game, this probably would have been my favorite Stego moment. Again, that's a big problem with these characters. A lot of their most interesting tidbits have to do with their relationship to Shadow. Speaking of Realm, my favorite moment featuring her is similar. When she and Stego escape from Kefka's tower, she says that maybe someday she'll paint a portrait of Stego. This is just another really cute moment between Grandpa and Granddaughter, and I really wish this dynamic was given more focus in the game as opposed to them being props for Shadow's story. While I like the dynamic that Shadow creates with them, I would also like for them to have been established more on their own before that thread was introduced. Anyway, the next character, Umaro, is a Yeti. There's not a lot to talk about with him, character-wise. He does throw people at enemies, which is pretty funny. I do find this action he takes to be quite funny. Also, Yetis are kind of like monkeys, I guess, maybe? I don't know. Funny Yeti man does funny things. Finally, we have Go-Go, who is a famous mimic and uses they-them pronouns, which is kind of based. Go-Go's shining moment is their introduction, because they don't have anything going on with them aside from that. Seriously, they have no other speaking scenes. However, I do think it's a very strong introduction. You see the cast get very clearly weirded out by Go-Go's presence, and I honestly think that it establishes very well that Go-Go is clearly someone different, but still reliable. It's fun, and sometimes things can just be fun without being meaningful, and it works. Well, that should wrap it up. I'm pretty sure there isn't anybody I'm forgetting from this lineup of characters who might be worth analysis, especially one that would be particularly difficult for me to choose a favorite scene for. This has been Arcade. Who could forget the star of the show, Kefka? No matter who you play through the game within your party, Kefka will always be there to oppose you. A consistent threat of grand proportions with a personality that's both infantile and genocidal, a critique of violent nihilism, we have one of my favorite villains in any video game ever. Kefka is everything the heroes aren't. He sees no meaning in the world around him and just wants it to end so all suffering will end. To him, entropy is the endgame, and life is a speedrun to reaching it. If somebody knows a character from Final Fantasy VI, it's bound to be Kefka. And there are way too many iconic moments with him for me to choose just one for the purposes of this video. But choose I must. And I have to choose the poisoning of Doma for me, because this moment changed everything I knew about video games when I first played it as a 12-year-old. I didn't realize video games could be so powerful, that they could tackle themes this heavy, until I saw an entire castle get murdered by a deranged clown man. I was in shock as I saw Cyan's family and entire country get wiped out. My heart sank. The general of the Gestalian army had raised my expectations for the game from that point on, and I don't think anything will ever compare to the shock I experienced when I first saw that scene. All the pain Cyan endured because of that, it's only fitting he go in my final party to face off against Kefka. I think that a character is truly great when they define a lot of your understanding of the work itself, and Kefka is one such example of a character. He, Celeste, Cyan, and the Figaro brothers all painted a very distinct picture of what Final Fantasy VI was meant to be when I played through it. An emotional story about epic battles and intense stakes with a heartwarming and deeply personal core. A story about banding together when the world is in crisis, even when all hope seems lost. Final Fantasy VI was the game that taught me what games could be, and its characters were no small part in that. This has been Arcade Everlasting, massive Final Fantasy VI apologist, signing off. Thank you for watching.